Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Idea Roastery. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
Herman, I want you to tell me about when I first met you. You started building a commuting platform where you could like transport yourself, longer distances than you could with Uber. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to point out that BlaBlaCar hadn't been established yet. This
Oh,
was a
really?
purely unique idea. So the idea was to get between cities or to and from festivals because it was also I was also of that age. I mean, I'm still of that age. I've gone to two festivals this year so far, but I digress. Um, and you essentially just list on the platform, hey, I've got two seats in my car. It'll cost each person 180 rand to ride with me, and the company was called Ride With. And it didn't do super well. I learned a lot. It was my first proper, entrepreneurial venture. I didn't do proper market validation. It turns out that South Africans are actually very hesitant to drive with strangers, and for very good reason. So there are many other ways that I could have validated this before building it,
Mm-hmm.
like by creating a Facebook group instead. But I was young and my eyes were full of stars, and off I went and tried to build it.
Do you think it would have been different if you were in today's environment where there's a lot more sort of tourism? Or did you ever look at like instead of targeting South Africans, targeting tourists?
So, to be entirely honest, I think that tourists, when they come to South Africa, is that they tend to come from North America and Europe. And South Africa is quite cheap comparatively. So they can actually get around fairly easily without having to, low budgeted like BlaBlaCar. I mean, I've heard like whenever I'm in an Uber, I make an effort to chat to the driver and ask him about his trips and everything. And they'll tell me that sometimes they'll pick up someone at the airport and the person will ask them to drive all the way to Hermanus. He's like, yeah, it's a really good payday because it's like 1,500 rand on the way
Mm-hmm.
over. And I'm like, 1,500 rand's a pretty hefty price to pay for an Uber until I think that when I was in Chicago, the cost of taking an Uber from Chicago to the Chicago airport was 30% more than that, right? So it is very inexpensive to get around in South Africa if you are from these, high income countries. So I actually don't really think that uh, it would even be that feasible right now, to be honest. I think tourists love South Africa. It's a good place to come if you've got money.
Yeah. So the idea I wanted to roast today is whether Cape Town needs more nomads, right? Because I think that little story kind of indicates the power that nomads can have in terms of like providing economic value to a country. I don't know about the price part because what really opened my eyes was my trip to Thailand, which is already a fairly low cost country in terms of like if you're from overseas it's pretty cheap to get around, but even so there's still quite a large amount of
Traveling on a budget.
travel options.
Now that you mention it, when I spent time in Southeast Asia, and even when I spent time in Cape Town as a tourist, lots of people who are actually nickel and diming it. So
Yeah, and I think it's maybe like there's kind of like a bit of a trend on X at the moment, like where Bali is becoming a bit more overrated, and so people are kind of like searching out where that next location would be. And I guess like cheapness is one of the benefits of having uh a digital nomad paradise, right? That they're looking for. Um, and yeah, I think like the transportation one is interesting because what I just being able to get like what is it equivalently a taxi, like a little minibus to take you like 2 hours, maybe even 4 hour journeys is like something that's I don't maybe the South Africans aren't quite used to it because there's like kind of that divide there,
mm,
but it's not exactly like a difficult thing to set up, and this is why I'm quite bullish on having more nomads because what I think has happened, well, there's obviously a lot of backlash against nomads because of inflated prices. But my thoughts is that maybe the first time you go to South Africa, you want to kind of stay within your comfort zone. But the second time you come, you might be more inclined to go more outside the beaten path, right? Like I went to like Bangkok and Chiang Mai, and I went a little bit further out. But maybe that sort of travel element would allow people to go a little bit more deeper into South Africa.
No, I completely agree with you with that. There's a lot to explore here as well, and most of it is off the beaten path. Like if you go onto Google and you say things to do in Cape Town, it'll give you the most like white rice list of things to do. That's
Yeah.
like visit the V&A waterfront. It's like that's literally just a mall.
I think what nomads bring is that they do bring first. I mean, there's pros and cons, right? And there's pros and cons to Cape Town as a nomads hotspot. I think they do bring this outside perspective. Even just having traveled to like one place that's like in Southeast Asia, like I've already got like loads of ideas of like
Mm,
how South Africa could benefit from tourism. One of them being that that cheap travel part,
yeah.
but the other one being just the diversity of things to do.
Oh
And
yeah.
I kind of boiled it down to like tourism is just a combination of like, let me show you something, let me take you somewhere. Why don't you do this thing that I think is really cool? Like, and
Yeah.
those are like the kind of things that you can do. And the way that it comes out is that the one place we just went on like a day tour, which was effectively like Westerner. We like day tour. Surely they're gonna like talk about what this place represents from a cultural perspective. Like we're gonna have this like good talk. Oh no, it was just like you get in the back of the bucky, they drive you to the spot, they tell you like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you like just walk around, and then 10 minutes goes, you get back in the bucky, and they drive you to the next spot. And so it kind of like opened my eyes to the fact that like you don't necessarily need to have like that much to just provide like a nomad experience.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like over time it might start out that like most nomads stay in Cape Town, but like driving someone further out into like Hermanus or like Stellenbosch or some of these other places might be like an enabling factor to make it a better prospect to have these nomads.
Yeah, so South Africa is trying to incentivize more. I think there's a distinction to be made over here between like nomads and tourists,
Mm,
where nomads are essentially tourists, but they're longer term and they're traveling on a semi-permanent basis. Um, so a bunch of countries around the world, including in Southern Africa, have released what are called nomad visas, digital nomad visas. I think in South Africa it is called the remote work visa, and it essentially says, "Hey, instead of just the regular 3 month tourist visa, you can come through on this nomad visa, and you can stick around for up to 3 years, and uh, you know, it incentivizes." It essentially incentivizes these high earning people, and there are salary requirements. Like you have to have a proof of funds, you have to have medical aid or medical insurance, travel insurance, stuff like that. And then you essentially come and live in South Africa and you spend your hard earned cash here. And so that's what the government is trying to incentivize, which I'm fully behind. It also really depends on where you are.
mm,
So I know that Portugal, the Portuguese are so hurtful of all the uh, all the nomads coming in there
yeah.
and getting and just nomading about and raising the prices of accommodation
Mm,
in Lisbon, and that's also what we're seeing in Cape Town. However, while Portugal has, pretty diverse economy, I guess South Africa does have a fairly diverse economy as well, but we are quite
mm,
reliant on tourism. Like tourism is very high up there. And so it makes sense to try and create these longer term tourists who will just come here and spend money at the coffee shops and go on safari and do
mm,
all of those things. So I think that South Africa is a spectacular place. If I
mm,
were not from here, I would certainly uh, come and visit here potentially long term because I mean, I I can choose where I want to live in the world, and I choose to live here. So I might be biased, but there are many, especially Germans and Dutch, who come here and they're like, "Oh, this is very nice. I want to stay
yeah.
here," and
Yeah.
so they do.
Yeah, exactly. What are some of the core elements do you think would be required for a nomad hotspot? Um, like just in terms of like the place, because
Mm.
I was trying to put it into my head, like Bangkok, Chiang Mai, like what is it that draws people to these spots? I mean,
I think that the number one thing is that it has to be I don't know how else to put it, but like significant, right? It has to be experientially significant, and that's a bit of a fuzzy term. But let's take, for instance, Dubai is trying to turn itself into a tourism place, but they're having a really hard time with it because they don't have anything that's really significant that's there already. They have
Mm.
desert, right? And they more recently have a lot of money, and so they're trying to create something significant by building,
Mm.
big shiny towers and other rich people experiences and islands. But something like Cape Town or South Africa as a whole is very significant in that it's got some of the most beautiful landscapes in the world, waterfalls, wildlife. It's got all of the big five, man. You can go on a safari in the north. You can go kayaking down the Orange River.
Mm.
You can go hang out in a desert or a rainforest or, the veldt.
Mm.
Like the number of things that make South Africa significant just from a like geography point of view is already
Mm.
like way up there. And then we've got so many like interesting cultural hotspots and histories and art and music and like all of these things make South Africa very significant. So
Yeah.
I think number one is significance, right? I think that Dubai is going to have a really hard time becoming that kind of significant. But
Mm.
then they're doing very well on every other measure. So the other measures are, there has to be pretty decent infrastructure because like shitty infrastructure does attract a certain kind of tourist, but not all of them. And you want to
Mm.
kind of attract all of them, right?
Yeah.
So like not everyone has the gumption to sit in 5 hours of Balinese traffic,
Yeah.
every day on their scooters huffing carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
But that's really fun for, someone who's in their 20s.
Mm.
So there's something to be said over there. And so South Africa has pretty decent infrastructure, at least in the areas that a nomad or tourist would likely be. And then, cost of living, really nice. This, however, is not a necessity. Like Japan accepts so many tourists and they're not that much cheaper than, or in some cases more expensive than the countries that the tourists come from.
Mm.
And then there needs to be, especially for nomads, there needs to be an incentive to do that. Like there has to be an incentive for you to come here and stay long term. So there's the usual tourist reasons, but there are also like Singapore and the UAE have also found other ways to incentivize people to like come there. Malaysia, especially,
Mm.
there's you can now get a I don't know if it's a visa, but it's called Malaysia My Second Home, where you can go and become a tax resident of Malaysia and pay, I think it's like 2 or 3% tax. So they're essentially just trying to get 2 or 3% tax on foreign sourced income. So they're saying, come make Malaysia your second home. Come here and become a tax resident. We're going to tax you at a very, very low rate for
Mm.
money that is earned not inside of the country. And also just spend your money inside the country, like rent an apartment, get a suit tailored, buy some
Mm.
coffee, etc., etc. That seems to be working out really well for Malaysia.
Yeah, I mean it's like I mean just tourism in general is just like how can you best utilize your natural assets to get you some money. And I think one of the things that I really like about South Africa as a destination is kind of this like wellness culture that's kind of populating around maybe just more specifically Cape Town. But there's something to be said about like being I think remoteness is also important. Like as you said, like experientially special.
Hmm.
Like remoteness is also can also contribute to that because it's kind of like it's in Africa, it's like far away from the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. It's kind of like in its like isolated like little environment at the end of the world.
But it's also
Uh,
exotic in that way.
so yeah, it provides a lot of like yeah, it's more exotic, right? But I think the other thing is, and I wanted to get your perspective on this is like, do you think like it's digitally like South Africa is digitally prepared for nomads in the sense that we were talking about like getting around and those kind of things? What kind of struck me in Thailand is that hey, it's like everything's kind of got a website and everything's got like there if you wanted to book a taxi, it's all like kind of online. Do you think we have that in South Africa, or do you think that's like an opportunity for someone to come in and say, like, well, Uber might be that big player. Is there like a sort of lower cost sort of way to get around, a way to find out, where all these experiences are, or is it just like going to be tour operators and hotels that are kind of like
Mm.
the players in this space?
I think that we already have these big Silicon Valley companies, your Airbnbs, your Ubers, your whatever, that are doing a lot of that over here. But I don't want to say empowering because that feels wrong. Because I don't think that they're necessarily empowering, but just making more accessible,
Mm.
access to like individual tour operators and stuff like that. So if you go onto Airbnb experiences and you say like, I want to go surfing, you'll be able to
Mm.
find 100 surf instructors who will take you out on a surfboard in Musenberg, and that's pretty neat. That's actually a really neat thing that is possible. Yes, you can go and you can Google surf lessons in Cape Town, and yeah, you'll find a dozen websites, but they will be of a variety of
Mm.
quality and receptiveness, and some of them won't have their prices on there, and
Yeah.
you have to email them or WhatsApp them or call
Yeah.
them. So there is something to be said about these aggregators that it's like, I want to do this, and you go and you check out.
Mm.
There's a bunch of other of these aggregators as well, TripAdvisor, etc.
Yeah.
And I think that they actually do benefit the local economy because it does allow small operators to become more visible
Mm.
without having to play the whole SEO game.
It does make them more visible, but I find I think it does require like longer period of time, right? Because I
Mm.
think if you're coming for a short, like 1 or 2 weeks, you're kind of looking for bang for buck, right? And I think people are
Mm.
like, they'll go onto TripAdvisor and look at like the top 20 things, and it'll be like hike Lion's Head and all these stuff that we really hate as like locals.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, literally, like when
yeah,
I say that the number one thing on all of these lists is go to the V&A waterfront, I'm not even kidding. It is actually at the top of all of these lists. And I suspect that it's actually just like SEO goobies that has been paid for
yeah.
by the V&A.
I mean, I guess like it is like a walkable, I guess.
Mm.
Maybe that's like an appeal, but maybe that's maybe part of it is like, are we not? Is there not enough creativity, or is it just like, that just seems to be the easiest thing to do, and people tend to rate it really highly, and maybe people are just coming from these countries where malls and strip malls and like that's the thing you do on the weekend.
Maybe, but like I do know, and I speak to a lot of tourists here in South Africa, and especially the Europeans, they're all like, "Oh, I want to do the things that are non-touristy." It's like they actually do want to do the things that are
Mm,
touristy. They just don't want to feel like they're being sold to. I think
mm,
that's the clincher over here, is that they take pride in trying to not do the touristy things. And the fact of
mm,
the matter is that like and this is just my personal opinion, tourist areas, depending on where you are actually kind of nice. They tend to be the historic centers of cities. They tend to be the nicer parts of town or by the beaches.
mm.
And yes, you will always have, those establishments that try to fleece tourists, but that isn't the rule. Like there, you will always have people who are exploitative. But the historic city centers where it's
Yeah,
walkable and nice are much nicer than the suburbs. The beachfronts,
yeah,
bars and stuff are much nicer than the
mm,
ones in the industrial parts of the city. Depending on what you're looking for. I mean, if you like your grungy punk,
yeah,
go to I House Sundays in Pardon Island. Um,
mm,
but actually, that
yeah,
brings
yeah,
that brings me to just a bit of a tangent over here. Um,
yeah,
one of the things I didn't talk about is safety, right? So, you obviously aren't going to go and be a tourist in like anywhere on the Horn of Africa, right? There isn't even government. I didn't even know how you'd get in
yeah. I
there.
mean, like,
There's
yeah,
no one to
maybe
stamp your
that's true.
passport. Um,
Yeah,
and so in South Africa, we have crime. It is an unfortunate
mm,
reality of the situation over here. We've got a pretty bad crime rate. However, it is unlikely to affect you if you
mm,
visit. I will go out on a limb, and I haven't run these numbers myself, but I will go out on a limb and say that you are more likely
Mm.
to fall off of your scooter in Bali and scrape yourself up really badly than be injured because of crime in South Africa.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen like three or four petty crimes in the last month, like just since being back. And this is London, like which is supposed
Yeah.
to be like a upstanding country. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's like the safety thing definitely makes more sense, but I think like, but that's what I'm like kind of bullish on tourism and nomads in general is it does potentially if there is like these creative outlets and it maybe requires like a bit of government support or a little bit of like NGO support to actually show people like hey you can if you like hiking just put it like hey hike group 5 people like Lion's Head or Table Mountain put it on
Mm,
Airbnb experiences and you're going to make a bit of cash, right? Like one of the experiences was just like some guys like taking a bicycle and cycling around like Bangkok and eating different types of food. It's like it's like these kind of experiences are like within reach. And if you're like a local, you're obviously going to know like spots that people maybe don't know, or even just like people can't be bothered to research or plan everything or book the tickets, or they can't quite figure out how much it's going to cost. You just say like all in package, we'll take you to the Helderberg Nature Reserve, or we'll take you to like this awesome wine farm. We'll drive you back. I think that'll unlock a lot of value. But I'm also really excited to have, the I think the Cape Town vibe is obviously what people like, but I'd like
mm.
that to kind of like move a little bit outwards. Like there's places in the winelands which would be pretty good small towns.
I find that this is like a big problem with tourist country, well, with countries that accept a lot of tourists, is that um, people fly into Cape Town and then they never really leave the city. They might like do a excursion out to Franschhoek for a day to drink some wine and then come back. Um, but if, for example,
Mm,
Japan is getting kind of sick of tourists. I mean, they want the tourists to carry on coming, but like uh, Osaka and Tokyo specifically are like pretty much overwhelmed with tourists, especially during the cherry blossom season, right? And it's pissing a bunch of locals off. And,
mm,
there are some restaurants that you go in there and you're obviously not
yeah.
Japanese, and they'll be like, no, no, Japanese only, right? And I get that. But as soon as you step out
Mm,
of the cities, there's no tourists. I saw this myself
mm,
when I was in
yeah.
Bali, which is one of the most heavily touristed islands on the planet. I was in Ubud, and there's tourists everywhere, just like everywhere you look, there's tourists. And then within riding for 20 minutes out of Ubud towards the north, not a single tourist. Everyone I passed was
Mm,
local. Um, it
yeah.
was actually pretty surreal. All the little towns and everything I went through, no tourists at all. And
Mm,
so I think that tourism is a very highly concentrated thing, and a useful lever to pull would be
mm,
for governments to find some way to incentivize tourists to move out of these hotspots and to experience more of the countryside and spread them out a little
mm.
bit, spread the burden.
Yeah, but I think it takes like creative marketing and also maybe just the demographic that comes in terms of like what age they are. I
Mm,
think it does tend to draw maybe like a younger crowd, which or obviously like I mean there's people who come on golfing holidays. It's quite broad like the types of people that come to South Africa. But yeah, I think I agree that there needs to be sort of this dispersal of the tourist sort of awesomeness so that small towns can also have some sort of economic activity. But there's the downside in that some places have become almost too geared to tourism. In that, I think there was one town that we were in where they have like a night market every night, just because like that brings in tourists, and that's probably their main source of revenue is just tourists buying food. And maybe for the people it's fine if you like cooking food all day. It can be quite like a like wholesome economic activity, I guess. You're not like breaking your back in the heat of the sun, but you can also get this fact where you're not quite integrating into the world. You're
it's like travel has been like fully commoditized. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is that I last year I was in Vietnam, as you know, and I think that the Vietnamese government, it is a socialist government, and they do have a lot of control, right? Um, but I think that they actually thought about this problem, and they found a way to pretty well spread tourists out. So instead of just people congregating in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, what they did is they created this route. You either go north to south or you go south to north. And pretty much everyone who goes and visits Vietnam follows this
Mm.
route, right? So, like, we started out in Ho Chi Minh
Yeah.
City, and then we went up to Da Nang and Hoi An, and then went further, Phon Nha, Ninh Binh, and then up to the north in Sapa,
Mm.
and then to Hanoi, or we also went to Halong Bay. But this is like a very
Ooh.
well greased route, and it just means that like they're spreading out the
Mm.
both the benefits, the economic benefits of having tourists to all these places, but they're also spreading out the economic burdens of having tourists to all these places, which is actually a really interesting way to do it. It does sometimes
Mm.
feel very superficial when it is such a well greased track. Like Sapa in the north of Vietnam. It's a beautiful area, like absolutely gorgeous. And you first walk into the town and it's like this, French colonial architecture and cobbled streets and everything. And you're like, wow, this is really nice. It feels like I'm in an, an older European city. Um, but then you realize this was built in the 2000s or like
Mm.
90s to 2000s. And it is entirely
Mm.
a city
Yeah.
fabricated for tourists to visit. Like the entire city is just it's built for tourists to go
Wow.
there. So it looks
Wow.
like a place where it has,
Mm.
small businesses. And yes, there are small businesses, but they're all restaurants and spas and other things catering to tourists. There's no like internal industry over there whatsoever. Right. So after the initial like, wow, this actually looks really cool,
Yeah.
it starts to sink in that it's like, this feels fake. So I guess there's trying to avoid that while you build out your
Mm.
tourism industry, huh?
It's like going into Durbanville or Tiger Valley. But put that there. They can go there. Yeah, I think maybe one of the last things we could touch on is just like, I guess with nomads and nomad visas, I think one of the challenges I think that any city or any like government that wants to try and attract them needs to think about is how do you break that barrier between travelers, nomad, and local? Because I think even in South Africa, we have like a very checkered past. Like we even just struggle to have like
Mm.
our own like citizens kind of work together. Like thinking of ways to, I guess maybe if you have a nomad visa and it is like linked to a skill, it's linked to like you've got some sort of income. I think the upside is that there's an opportunity to share that information, or share like best practices or like a worldview, and potentially upskill people,
Mm.
provide value in terms of creating small businesses. But I guess the check is that, does this happen? Like, do people actually share their knowledge? Like when you go to a small country, are you actually going to host a workshop, or are you going to do something that's going to benefit, or is it just purely an economic?
So from the way that these visas are set up, from all the places that I've looked, it is purely economic. They are actually disincentivizing people from doing business inside the country because they don't want you to come in here and do set up a South African retail blah, 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 right? So because as soon as you do that,
Mm,
then okay, well actually I have some nuance about the tax over there, but um, yeah, so you have to have a proof of employment or income offshore, and you are explicitly forbidden from doing economic business in South Africa. So if you do run a workshop, you're not allowed to charge money for it. And by doing that, they disincentivize people from running
mm,
from running workshops in the way that the government knows how financially.
yeah.
So there's a secondary thing is that if a person comes and spends half a year in South Africa or in Portugal or most of these other places where they would go and be a digital nomad, they are technically eligible to pay taxes in those countries. They become a tax resident of them by being there for 6 months with intention to
Mm,
stay. Um, and so far, I haven't heard of South Africa demanding that these nomads file their taxes and declare their worldwide income
mm,
and get taxed on their worldwide income. But I have read the SARS legislation and they are legally obligated to. So SARS is probably not going to bother any of these people
Mm,
to go and do that, but they are legally obligated to. So that is something to also keep in
yeah,
mind. If you are going to go and nomad somewhere, you're
yeah.
probably obligated to pay taxes there.
Mm.
And so just get a feel of the land before you go.
I yeah, I think that's also maybe part of aggression towards nomads is that they do. I mean, this is not just in South Africa. Like technically, in any country you visit, there is like some sort of presence test, and it's usually around 90 days, or like 3 months. And I mean, you're not supposed to be working, but if you do, you're supposed to pay tax on that. And it's I think South Africa is just maybe a little bit ahead of the curve because of some of the sort of blacklisting that's been going on a country level. They've had to like implement like stronger regulation on who is operating within their country. But yeah, maybe that's like something that's going to be a digital solution in the future because I think I've heard there's this dude called Naval, and he's got this idea of like this sort of digital citizenship idea where you don't necessarily have citizenship of where you live. It's like the group that you're part of, and you can kind of like switch it, and you
Mm.
can choose which tax jurisdiction you want to be a part of.
It's really interesting, but it will never come to pass. Because that would essentially mean that every single country would have to say, we're a territorial tax. We have a territorial tax system, and the only countries that have like territorial tax systems are like
Mm.
Panama and Singapore and the UAE, which are I don't want to say tax havens. They're
Yeah,
tax-friendly jurisdictions, but most countries tax based on residency.
I'd never say never because I think it could be like that a small country. I think there was like a lot of hubbub like many years ago about Estonia and like the Estonian passport and like you could get it like digitally and you could register there online. Like I think like if you're a small nation and you want to attract like this is it's happening anyway. People want to attract income into your country. Maybe it would be like shunned upon, but if there is like a legitimate like, hey, I've got an Estonian or I've got like this sort of weird passport, and everyone just knows that they can just it's very or every country knows they can quite
Yeah.
easily claim taxes against it. Maybe it would make it like it will allow them in, and we just know that this guy's from this like nomad country, and we can quite easily claim that tax without even having to do the whole sort of police.
So I know that both Panama and the UAE, if you invest $200,000 in the country, either in real estate or into a company or something
Mm,
like that, then they'll essentially give you citizenship, which with it comes the passport, it comes
mm,
tax residence, etc., etc. Now, that's awesome because
mm,
it means that you can essentially go and do this nomad thing, but it's only really available for people who have $200,000 to throw around. And also, by being a tax resident
yeah.
of Panama, it doesn't mean that you aren't a tax resident elsewhere, right? And so that's the clincher. Is like you could go and
Yeah.
become a tax resident of Panama, and you can tell everyone that you're a tax resident of Panama, but where you are an actual resident with intent. I think SARS talks about intent a lot, with
Mm,
intent to stay. That you have to pay taxes over there. Also,
yeah.
Panama, like a lot of their doing banking over there is difficult because of how uncompliant they are with the rest of the world. So
Yeah.
I'd steer clear.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, this has been a great chat.
Yeah.
Nice talking to you. Cheers.